Raheem Kassam, all of Australia, here he is finally. You get to see the man we are so terrified, the great, dreadful person. Here he is in person. Keneally didn't like him, Albo didn't like him, they've demonised him for 2 weeks. Welcome to Credlin, welcome to Sky, welcome to Australia, Raheem Kassam. How are you, mate?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me, but secondly, what was that I just saw? Those two blokes, they look like the reason there's instructions on the shampoo bottle.
Well, that's Australian politics, Raheem. You've got a lot to catch up on. There are some almost as daft as Keneally and Albo. Now, let's cut to the chase quickly. You made a brilliant speech at CPAC this afternoon. We'd all been told you were the worst thing since the devil incarnate. You made a superb speech, standing ovation. Everybody loved what you had to say. We're going to go into some of those topics. But just tell us quickly, 2 weeks ago, you wake up, you're all over Twitter and Google and social media. You're the worst thing. You've been demonised by some senator under parliamentary privilege in Australia. What did you make of that, and what's happened since?
Honestly, I really didn't know what to do about it. I had never even thought about that I'd ever get to the great privilege of visiting Australia, and then I was asked to speak at Australia CPAC, and I was chomping at the bit to come over here and see this great country. And then I saw all these bizarre attacks on me. I mean, in the United Kingdom, I'm sort of seen as a behind-the-scenes figure. In the United States, I'm probably seen as a bit of a centre-right moderate, if anything. And these guys are telling me that I'm a hate speaker and all these crazy things. I mean, I grew up in a Muslim family in Great Britain, in West London. So for Senator Keneally to start lecturing me on Islamophobia when I spent 20 years in Islam and she spent about 20 minutes loitering outside a mosque, I really wasn't sure about what to do about it. So I just sort of took it in my stride and thought, well, she's giving me publicity. She's giving CPAC publicity. My old boss, Nigel Farage, is speaking there tomorrow. More power to them. Let them boost us. Let them amplify us. Let ordinary Australians see what we're really about. Great. I love it.
So, Raheem, tell us a bit about what you do. You write for Breitbart. You're a commentator. If you were in Australia, you'd be on Sky After Dark. No doubt about that, I imagine. But tell us a bit about what you do, and then tell us about your journey through Islam, growing up and going to university, and some of the things you mentioned today at CPAC.
Yeah, look, I mean, my whole thing is... For my sins, I'm in politics, right? So I do policy, I do commentary, I write books. I've written 2 best-selling books. I've travelled, I've reported from on the ground in no-go zones in Europe. I've actually gone to see the things that Keneally talks about but would never do herself. And yeah, I used to work at Breitbart, and I've written for a multitude of other places like the Wall Street Journal, and I've been interviewed lots of times by the BBC and so on and so forth. So for me, it was really bizarre to be thought of being banned from a country. I mean, the establishment, as much as I loathe it, they still seem to have some sort of attachment and fealty to me, which I'm pleased about, which is obviously very important for discourse and debate. My primary concern in life is to represent the ordinary person, the working person, to make sure that we're getting a fair shout in life rather than just the political elites. I was raised in Islam. My parents are still Muslim, or my family is still Muslim. I just decided it wasn't for me, and I decided to start speaking up about it about 13 years ago. And why I left, and as I said earlier at CPAC, I was at the University of Westminster. I was 1 year ahead of Jihadi John, the ISIS beheader, the executioner, at university. And when I left university, I was so aggrieved by what was taking place, both in the name of the religion that I was raised in and in the country that I love so much, the United Kingdom, that I set up a counter-extremism pressure group to highlight the radical Islamist speakers who were coming in, being paid for, bought and paid for, by the Turks, by the Saudis, and show them up for who they really are. People who wanted homosexuals thrown off mountains and buildings, people who wanted female genital mutilation, people who wanted to kill all Christians, people who referred to Jews as pigs and apes. And I was doing all of that counter-extremism work, and I still do that today. And meanwhile, by the way, Senator Keneally and her boss in the Labour Party leader, they stand shoulder to shoulder with people like Emily Thornberry, Lady Nuji from Britain's Labour Party. That is a party that has anti-Semitism at its core. Jeremy Corbyn is friends with Hamas, friends with Hezbollah, friends with the IRA, works for the Iranian Press TV channel, yet I'm supposed to be the one who's an extremist. Senator Keneally should be ashamed of herself, and I'll tell you what, there should be an investigation into just how much the Australian Labour Party knows about the British Labour Party and why they still stand shoulder to shoulder with them. I think Australians should be demanding answers on that basis.
Well, I certainly agree with you that Bill Shorten, who was not elected, who ran for Prime Minister very recently in our election, he cited Jeremy Corbyn as a role model at some point and somebody that he should be looking to. So I agree with you there. But take us through the extent of Islamic radicalism within the universities in Britain and within the mainstream. You experienced that yourself. You told this morning of walking down the street, a story there. Tell us about the extent of that penetration, if you like, into the universities of Britain from radical Islam.
So it's massive. It started really in the 70s and 80s with countries like Saudi Arabia paying for chairs in Islamic studies across the university sector in the United Kingdom. It led to a lot of fundamental interpretation of Islam being commonplace at UK universities, to the point where I was once invited to an Islamic Society meeting at the University of Westminster, right slap bang in the heart of London on Regent Street, for those that know it. And as I was going into this meeting, I was walking up the stairs to this little Titchfield Street building, and three of the guys that were inside the Islamic Society meeting came down the stairs towards me. And they said, "Brother, you don't want to go in there." I said, "Why not?" They said, "They're showing videos of 9/11 and clapping and cheering." And as I always tell the story, I decided not to go into the Islamic Society meeting. I went to the pub instead, and I've never left.
Fantastic. So I wanted to ask you about Brexit. You're here to, obviously, you mentioned Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage will be on Outsiders on Sunday morning on this channel. You work closely with him. With the rise of Boris Johnson, explain to me, explain to our viewers, what's the tension there? What's the likelihood of Boris Johnson getting Brexit achieved? Could there be an election beforehand? Could we see some kind of coalition with Nigel and Boris? What's your take on it, Raheem?
Well, it's a very tricky situation, of course, because the Conservative Party ceased to be conservative back when, effectively, they got rid of Margaret Thatcher all those years ago. And the torch has been passed from neoliberal to neoliberal, from squish to squish, from milquetoast leader to milquetoast leader, from Major to Howard to Cameron to May, and now to, of course, Boris Johnson. And Boris is, again, very liberal for my liking. He believes in amnesty for all illegal immigrants into the United Kingdom. He believes in free market economics and not much else. So it's not the best thing for Conservatives in the United Kingdom. It's not the best thing for Brexit. He has a real problem in terms of the parliamentary math, in terms of getting a no-deal Brexit, which is a Brexit without having a prefigured trade deal with the European Union, because it has to go through Parliament, and because he lost this by-election, this special election very recently. So what looks like it will happen is that he'll go to Parliament, he'll do the same thing as Theresa May did, albeit a little bit more robustly, albeit with a little bit more classical and sort of bravura-based language. And he'll obviously have to call a general election at some point and try to change the makeup of Parliament. At that point, he has to consider an electoral pact with Nigel Farage and his new Brexit party, which, of course, won the European elections just earlier this year by a very, very big margin. At the moment, people are talking about a 30 to 50 seat electoral pact between the two. Of course, you have the great Australian strategist Lynton Crosby working for the Conservative Party, and he is fearsome and he is very good at what he does. He helped the Conservatives keep a general election majority in 2015, beating UKIP, which was the Brexit Party's predecessor the time before. But this time it looks like they will have to enter into somewhat of an agreement, or at least an understanding, an electoral understanding with Nigel and the Brexit Party. And what that means in practice is a parliament that is made up primarily of Brexiteers, of people who believe, by hook or by crook, Britain should leave the European Union. And so I expect by January or February next year, we will have a very different looking parliament, and it will result finally, after 3.5 long years, of Britain getting out of the European Union. And I understand that Nigel will have some choice things to say about that at CPAC tomorrow morning. But I just want to say this as well to this audience. you know, you look at the state of politics here in Australia, look at the state of politics in the United States, and you look at the state of politics in the United Kingdom. Conservatives have a lot to be hopeful about. They have a lot to be thankful about. Ordinary people, working class people, are starting to realise that under national conservative governments, they get better wages, they get immigration controls, they get lower unemployment, they get traditional values, they get the things that made Western civilization great. And we're about to make it great again.
There's a catchy phrase there somewhere, isn't there, Raheem? You were quite inspirational at CPAC when you followed that thought through, and you were actually saying Conservatives are winning around the world. Often it doesn't feel like that. The long march through the institutions, the left seem... Here, as you yourself noticed on the plane this morning, reading the paper, we've now got transgender athletes, and we seem to be in this abortion laws that have been redone and allowing, arguably, for sex selection abortions to take place. So there seems to be this wave of leftism that has swamped many of our countries, but you see that there is an upside.
Yeah, there is an upside. I mean, you look at Italy, you look at the US, you look at Hungary, you look at Brazil, you look at India. You know, those places are increasingly getting better at spotting this stuff a mile off and combating it before it takes root. Of course, you know, now the feminists in this country, in Australia, happen to want men to play on the women's cricket team. That doesn't sound like feminism to me. It puts us in an extraordinary situation where actually Conservatives are the feminists. Conservatives want women to be able to play women's sports and succeed in women's sports, whereas the left want men to dominate women's sports. So I think people are starting to wake up to the perverseness of all of this and the bizarreness of all this. We're also starting to wake up to what's going on with all of these strange cultural perturbations that are taking place. I mean, you've got some extraordinary stories out there at the moment about things like transgender library reading hour. And a big story that as a result of this was Jessica Yaniv, this woman who was found to be actually trying to get 12-year-old girls to go and take pool swimming lessons with her being a former biological man. And it's all sort of unraveling for the left. They're kind of eating themselves. And that's why I was so pleased with what this chicken, Senator Keneally, did. And I say chicken because she knew I was coming into the country, she knew I entered the country, and she refused to come to CPAC and debate me nevertheless.
You did invite her.
But I think there were people out there.
You did invite her.
I did invite her, of course I invited her. I want people to hear the arguments. I want people to hear why someone like me, from a Muslim ethnic minority background, is a conservative, and why people like Keneally, who claims to be a Catholic, but meanwhile hides behind parliamentary privilege to insult someone like me and to try and ruin my livelihood and really to try and put my life at risk. I want people to hear why those things are taking place. The truth of the matter is, they are slaves to an ideology, whereas people like myself, we want ordinary people to just get a fair shout in life. That's all I'm asking for. You know, my parents went bankrupt in '92 when George Soros shorted the pound. I want people to understand that that's not what we're about. We're not for crony capitalism. We're not for hyper-capitalism. We are for a good shout for ordinary people. And Senator Keneally, if you're watching this, shame on you.
Raheem Kassam, thank you so much. Such a pleasure to have you in Australia. There'll be an awful lot of people sitting there saying, actually, they're really glad that Keneally had a go at you because now they've met you, now they've seen you, and they're going to be watching you and following you on Twitter. And I urge people to go and buy Raheem Kassam's books, particularly No-Go Zone and others. Find them on Amazon and buy them and read them. Raheem, thanks so much for talking to us here on Credlin tonight. Enjoy the rest of your time in Australia, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, mate.
Thank you. Cheers.